Who is actually the best first E5? This has been an argument for so long in the Idle Heroes community, and the problem is the question in and of itself is flawed. There are two sides of people that argue what is the best first E5, and the problem with these two camps is they can never ever agree. It is actually logically impossible for them to agree. Let me tell you why. The term best is actually undecided amongst the community because there's two key things you need from a first E5. You need them to be accessible and you need them to be powerful. And the issue is, when people say best, most people think powerful, and there's a certain school of thought that thinks accessible. And the problem is these people can never agree because they're defining the term best differently. The other thing is, the very question in and of itself is flawed because it assumes that you have some measure of choice over your first E5, which hopefully I will be able to debunk that myth and hopefully convince you guys that you have very little choice over who your first E5 is for one simple reason. Accessibility is more important than power. It's very fun to theory craft and to say, ooh, this hero is really strong at this, or this hero is very powerful at that, and this hero is the most optimal first E5 if you can build them because they're so strong at all these different game modes. The only issue is, if you can build them is the key part of that sentence, because if you can't build them, they're not optimal because you can't build them. There's no point getting excited about a car that you can't afford. Does that make sense? So let's talk about this. First things first, we have accessibility. As an early game player, building your first E5 requires quite a lot of investment. First of all, you need a 9-star to take your hero from 9 to 10. You need a 9-star to go to E1, you need another 9-star for E2, you need another 10-star hero for E3, and then 2 more 10-stars for E4 and E5. So in total, that's 3 9-stars and 3 10-stars to get all the way from 9-star to 10-star. That's not to mention the fact that you need 3 copies of the hero you're building to get them to 9-star, 2 more for 10-star, and then to get all the way up to E5 from there, 4 additional copies. So that's 9 copies in total of the hero you're building that you will need to go ahead and build them to E5. 9 copies of an elite hero that can be void imprinted is not easy to get, except for one hero, Garuda. Garuda is so accessible in the early game because of chapter rewards and the various chests which you can get from spending, and even just being given as a reward from the new VIP update makes her so easy to get copies of, whether you spend a little bit of money or even no money at all, because the chapter event gives you just so many for playing the game. So lots of people ask, hey MK, who is the best first E5? Well, if the one thing you value is accessibility, the answer is Garuda, because Garuda is so easy to build as an E5 that building her first is so easily done. It's just recommended. Build Garuda, it's impossible not to, you're definitely going to get the copies, go nuts, is what a lot of people will say. Because the golden rule of early game is actually, it doesn't matter who your first E5 is, just build one. Building your first E5 is so important, it doesn't matter who it is, just go ahead, build them, and unlock the void. The issue is, when I go ahead and make a video where I start talking about the power level of heroes, the very people that I was preaching to and explaining that actually accessibility is important get annoyed and call me an idiot because power is a different definition of best. The power that you want from an early E5 is they need to be able to get to Death 1 in Aspen Dungeon, they need to be good enough in their Seal Land that building them isn't a wasted investment, and they also need to be able to help you and have good sustain so that they can push you in potentially PvP if you wanted to, but more importantly, the Void when you unlock it, and help you get further in Tower of Oblivion. Garuda is good at these things, but she's not the best. But because she's so accessible, she becomes the benchmark. If anyone is worse than Garuda, there is no point building them because you're guaranteed to get the copies of Garuda. That means Garuda is the worst, best first E5 because she is the cutoff point. If anyone sucks more than Garuda, they don't even get considered because Garuda is always an option. Therefore, you need to have the mindset that always building Garuda, unless you have someone better, is good. The problem is when we start discussing better first E5s, the attitude shifts because we start talking about power as opposed to accessibility. Because when you start saying, hey, choose your first E5, you're making the assumption that accessibility isn't an issue. For example, when I started the VIP series or the free-to-play series, lots of people turned around to me and said, hey MK, who are you going to build as your first E5? That's a bad question, because hands down the answer is whoever I get copies of. Now for most people, that's Garuda. However, in the first month of playing, you get a 5-star hero selection chest from Imps Adventure, you'll get another one from Sky Labyrinth, so that's 2 opportunities to choose your 5-star heroes. As well, you might high roll in Prophet Orbs and get Eloises, Ithaquas, Pennies, who knows, depends what faction you go in, although my recommendation would be Shadow, because the selection of Shadow heroes right now is so good. But for example, if you do high roll multiple Eloises or multiple Ithaquas, great, that's going to push you ahead. Maybe you get lucky and the shelter mission that you join in on actually gives you someone like Ithaqua, Eloise, or Penny. How fantastic. And you can go ahead and build Ithaqua, Eloise, or Penny instead of Garuda if you get more copies of them. And there's the key term, if you get more copies. There are plenty of heroes that can be made to E5 who are better than Garuda as a first E5. Ithaqua, Penny, Eloise. They're the standout 3 because they are from factions that are non-light and dark. There's not really anyone in the Abyss faction. Waldeck is okay, Delacium's okay, Morax is okay, but they don't really beat Garuda. They're just as good as. You could say Waldeck is better because Sealand clears are slightly easier with him, so yeah, I guess Waldeck could come into that list, but still, it's a matter of taste, you could say. However, the Light and Dark faction actually has some really good heroes. You've got Russell, you've got Aspen, you've got Drake. You could even argue that Ada and Carrie are also good first E5s. Now, for that, there's one key issue. Accessibility of Light and Dark heroes is super duper low. The only ever time people have been able to build Light and Dark heroes as their first E5s was actually the most recent anniversary event, because you were able to swap heroes from any faction to heroes from any other faction. So you were able to swap a 9-star Garuda to a 9-star Russell. Like that. It was an incredible event. It was fantastic. Loads of people were able to make tons of progress and build heroes they wouldn't even dream of for the stage they were on their account. And that was really, really cool. But that's not a common thing. That's why the VIP series started with a Drake. No one should start with an E5 Drake normally, unless you plan on spending a ton of money. And even then, if you're spending a lot of money, what you're doing is also increasing your accessibility to heroes like Eloise and Penny. And I'd argue they're just better investments as a first E5. With all that considered, what do you even need to do to build this first E5? Why does any of this matter? Why are we even talking right now? Well, it all comes down to the question, who is actually the best first E5? And as you've probably noticed at this point in the video, the term best is hazy. Because if you choose accessibility, the answer's always going to be Garuda. But if you know there's more powerful E5s out there, you don't feel comfortable to say that she's the best, because it's not true if you determine power as the best. So, here's my point. If you go ahead and you build a 10-star hero, the key thing here is you should feel comfortable using them as food. So it could be a Dantalion, it could be Karim, it doesn't really matter. It could be Gru, for goodness sake, Valkyrie, Unimax 3000, just anyone that's a good early hero that you can comfortably fodder off. You build them as your first 10-star, level them up, get them strong enough that they can start doing stuff for you, you'll begin to make a little bit of progress. In that time, also build some other 9-stars and some other 10-stars, but don't level them up, just leave them around, prepared to use them as food, because those 9-stars and 10-stars can be used to feed to your first E5. And in the time that you accumulate these heroes that you're going to feed to your first E5, you get loads of copies of Eloise. Eloise is going to be your first E5. If in that time you get yourself a ton of copies of Penny, Penny is going to be your first E5. But if you don't get like 7, 8, or 9 copies of anybody else that's a key standout first E5, you know who you will have copies of? Garuda, because of the chapter mission and the other areas of the game. If you're scratching your head at that point, saying, who should I build? The answer is Garuda, because you don't have copies of anybody else. The luxury of choice is for those that get lucky. And it's not for everybody. It's easier for spenders, and it's not for everyone. So if you go into the communities, whether it's on Discord, Reddit, Facebook, most people will say build Garuda as your first E5 because she's accessible and guaranteed. The way I choose to play, which is by building the 9-stars and 10-stars first, gives you the opportunity to see if you're going to high roll. But here is the final thing I want to stress to you guys. If, At any point, you could possibly build that Garuda to E5, but you're holding off just in case you get 9 copies of Eloise or 9 copies of Penny. Don't stop yourself from unlocking the void. You have to build that E5 Garuda straight there, and then build the Eloise or the Penny or Ithaca or whoever it is as your second E5. Because by unlocking the void, you're going to make the most progress for yourself by unlocking Crystals of Transcendence, Stellar Shards, beginning to make moves in the Realms Gate, just all the stuff that you need to do to get yourself established so that you can start making progress. The Void Arc is so important for this because the sooner you start building Star Spawns, the better. The sooner you get eggs, the better. There's just so much benefit to unlocking the void as soon as possible. And therefore, you should never hold back on being able to build your first E5, and that's why so many people say building Garuda as your first E5 is the best, because they stress accessibility and how efficiently you can do it as the key factor. And if you can mitigate accessibility and efficiency by being able to build someone else just as easily as you build a Garuda, then brilliant, do that. But that requires an enormous amount of luck on your part to get the 9 copies of the hero you're chasing. And there's an issue. Chasing a hero just to try and get 9 copies of them instead of Garuda is nice if it works, but it probably won't. So, the take home for this is if you find yourself in a situation where you don't have the choice to build a first E5, obviously build Garuda. If you do have the luxury of choice because you do have a ton of copies of Eloise or Penny, build them. It's that simple. So the answer to who is actually the best first E5 is whoever you get copies of. It is down to luck and nothing else. If you're lucky, well done. If you're not, build Garuda. Either option is fine, your account won't get stung for building Garuda, and you'll be okay. So don't worry about that. Now, if you're brave, you could even build Garuda as your first 10-star and feed her off if you get a ton of copies of Eloise. Now, the reason I argue for this is because actually, you're probably not going to go after warrior tech if you can build any other hero as your first E5. The only time people do build warrior tech early on is if Garuda is their first E5. In any other circumstance, warrior is the weakest class in the game. You're not going to go building any warriors very soon, so you can actually feed off Garuda copies, because in the time that you do eventually want to build a Garuda on your account and establish warriors as a guild tech, you should hopefully have the 9 copies of Garuda because she's pretty accessible and not too difficult to get your hands on. So just bear that in mind. Feeding off a 10-star Garuda early on isn't the worst thing you can do if you know what you're doing. But again, be careful, be brave, and make sure you're comfortable with that before you go too crazy. But given that knowledge, you can still build Garuda as your first 10-star and then establish the other 9 stars and 10 stars around to see if you do get lucky and build an Eloise. But if you don't get the copies of Eloise, if you don't get the copies of Penny, if you don't get the copies of Ithaca, or anyone else for that matter, that you do want to build as a first E5, then build Garuda. I probably sound like a broken record at this point, so I'm hopefully going to end the video here. And I hope that this has managed to add some clarity to an argument that has been rife in the community for the last few weeks now. The main thing is that I want to stress before I go is you're both right. When you argue about who the best first E5 is, those of you that are arguing based on accessibility, yes, you're correct. Garuda is the most accessible and easiest to build first E5, so she's good for that reason. But those of you that are arguing there are heroes that are better than Garuda, yes, you're correct, there are. But it depends if you're able to get the copies of them and if you're able to build them. So you're both correct, because the people that are arguing for other heroes are assuming accessibility isn't an issue. Those that argue for Garuda are acknowledging accessibility as an issue. So the important thing for those of you out there is to remember, the best first E5 is the one you can build. And then you can start making a choice based on power. I'll see you next time. Happy idling.